Hi. So I think everyone here understands the kind of population changes that are going to be coming over the coming decades. We have low fertility, a high life expectancy, so we can expect to have population aging, slower population growth, and in some countries, population decline. There's probably less agreement about what the economic effects of that are likely to be. But that's the subject matter that we're addressing in this paper, and I'm working with Ron Lee, but also members of the NTA network who contributed to this paper, and there are over 70 of them who are listed here. So, is population aging, declining population, a looming crisis? Well, if you read what's in the media, not surprisingly, it's pictured as a looming crisis, but not everyone thinks that. And I think there's a lot of interesting questions to decide to what extent is this a crisis or not, and we're going to talk about that. So our assessment uses a simple model that's just a product of the interaction between changes in population size and age structure and the human life cycle. So what do I mean by the human life cycle? Well, we know that the young and the old consume more than they produce through their labor. And people at young and old ages, often called dependents, rely on resources generated during the working ages. So changes in population age structure clearly create economic imbalances. Some of them are good and some are bad, and they express themselves in important ways. So the data and methods we use are as follows. So population estimates and projections come from the most recent edition of UN World Population Prospects. The National Transfer Account estimates of labor income and consumption by age for 186 economies come from the NTA network. And so labor income includes earnings, the labor share of self-employment income, and the value of unpaid family labor. Consumption is a broad measure. It's both public and private consumption as measured in the system of national accounts and allocated across age. The construction of these profiles relies on methods that are described in the UN National Transfer Accounts Manual that's available online. So this illustrates the kind of data that we're using. And the purpose is to emphasize that we have data for each country, and that is used to look at the economic effects of changing population in each country and then aggregate it up to get the total values. So I'm not going to go into the details here, but the key point is that labor income profiles and consumption vary across country depending upon the kinds of policies, the levels of income, the decisions that policymakers are making, and so forth. And so it's important to incorporate this in the analysis. So we combine population counts by age, both estimates and projections, with fixed age profiles of per capita labor income and consumption to construct various measures like the size of the effective labor force or the support ratio, the demographic dividend, and so forth. The thing I want to emphasize is that these are all business as usual scenarios. So no response by governments or individuals is being considered. And hopefully governments and individuals will respond to changes in population age structure, but we're estimating what will happen if they don't. So the first finding is that the era of population-driven economic growth is ending. So we decompose the growth in global GDP into two components. One is the growth of productivity, or GDP per effective worker, and the other is the growth of effective labor. So the productivity is based on historical estimates for the most part. We use the values that we use will reflect the effects of capital deepening, human capital investment, innovation, and other factors. But population doesn't play an indirect role that is being assessed here. The growth of effective labor is where population is really having an impact. It incorporates the number of people who are at each age and how that's changing over time, and what kind of labor income people at that age produce. So this incorporates the effects across countries on the level of labor productivity. And this is very important because changes in the number of workers in a country with very low labor productivity will have much less impact on global GDP than changes in a country which has very high labor productivity. So, briefly, what's the outcome of this analysis? Well, we can look at the historical data first from 1950 to 2020. And I think a key point here is that the peak growth of effective labor occurred in 1975 to 2000. And at that time, effective labor was growing by 1.7% per year. And we see that that's declined since then, but it's going to be very small between 2020 and 2060, growing at only 0.14% per year. So the share of growth due to population drops from 58% to 6%. So almost all of GDP growth will depend on growth of productivity and not growth in the sheer number of workers. The second finding, population change will drive large regional shifts in economic activity. Well, regions aren't really organized, in the normal kind of definition by their demographic characteristics. So, for example, the countries that are experiencing a decline in the effective number of workers are in Europe and they're in Eastern Asia. And we've grouped them together in this figure. And you can see that for the next 40 years, the effective number of workers is expected to decline by 0.5% per year, down from over 1% between 1950 and 2020. So if we group the Americas, Southeast Asia, and Oceania, except for Melanesia, we see growth in the effective number of workers in the next 40 years will be about 0.3% per year. Positive, although very slow. And this is, again, a very sharp decline from what was experienced between 1950 and 2020. Now, we'll just kind of combine Group 3 and Group 4 together. I suppose, in a way, Group 4 is the most interesting because it is going to experience the most rapid growth in the effective number of workers over the next 40 years at around 1.5% per year. So this is still slower than what they've been experiencing, but still quite robust growth. Now, the third factor I want to emphasize is that primate adults, it seems, are being squeezed by population aging. So the idea here is that resources are, at any point in time, a fixed pie. Mostly it's prime-age adults who are the first ones who lay their hands on these resources because they have asset income and heavily they have labor income. And so what do they do with that? To what extent do they share it with seniors and with children, or to what extent do they keep it for themselves? Well, there's been a lot of speculation and research about this issue in the past. Here's what our data shows us. This is a very simple kind of analysis. It's not a projection. This is comparative data for about 2010. And we've taken the 173, no, well, actually, yeah, less than that, around 173 countries, and we've divided them by what the consumption at old ages is and what the consumption at young ages. So on the vertical axis, we have consumption of people 65 and older relative to consumption 25 to 64. And you can see that on average, seniors have about the same per capita consumption as prime-age adults. And then if we look at children, that's measured on the horizontal axis, you can see that on average, children have about 80% of the consumption of prime-age adults. So there's a lot of differences across countries, though, and the red ones are the ones that are aging, that are oldest, and Japan, for example. And you can see that most of these countries fall in the eastern quadrant, which means that they have high consumption of seniors and they have high consumption of children. And so who does this affect? Well, it's prime-age adults that are getting squeezed by this behavior. 4 addresses how changes in age structure affect per capita income, not total income, which we were talking about earlier. So this really depends on the region or the kind of country that we're talking about. So changes in age structure are likely to boost per capita economic growth in low and lower middle income countries, but it's likely to inhibit growth in high and upper middle income countries. So to reach that conclusion, we rely on the support ratio, which is the number of workers, effective workers, relative to the number of effective consumers. And you can see that starting in the 1970s or so, in a lot of the regions of the world, not low-income countries, but elsewhere, the support ratio began to rise. And so this led to a boost to standards of living. So the first dividend, which is the rate of growth of the support ratio, is positive during this era. The low-income countries experienced the demographic dividend somewhat later. It started near the turn of the century, around 2000, and it's going to be occurring in the future while other countries, while the high and middle-income countries are experiencing a decline. So the fifth point, population aging, viewed from an economic perspective, is accelerating sharply in high-income and upper middle-income countries. So how do we reach this conclusion? Well, to judge aging from an economic perspective, we take a simple measure. We say, well, what is the amount of consumption beyond labor income that must be funded by labor income? So seniors have a big gap between their consumption and their labor income, and so they must rely on resources that come from different possibilities, but one of them could be labor income. So let's suppose that taxes on labor income was used to fund the old age gap entirely. So in 2020, that would mean that about a quarter of labor income would be required, or it would have to be taxed in order to fund old age needs. For countries and other income groups, aging is much further along, but also consumption at older ages is lower in these countries, so that also has an effect on our conclusion. The thing that really strikes me about this figure is how sharply the old age gap is rising. So it rose very slowly for many decades, but now it's really accelerated, and so we see this rapid increase in high-income countries, but also in upper-middle-income countries. But the increase will be greatest in high-income countries, and the old age gap would reach 45% of total labor income by 2060 if we don't do anything about it. Okay, so population aging will increase pressure for more private assets and or more public debt. The impact on capital is uncertain. Well, let me elaborate on this a bit. So what are we measuring here? So we could ask for any individual, including yourself, how much assets would I need in order to fund my old age needs? And that would depend on how much you're going to consume and what your labor income was and how long you were going to live would be and what kind of return you could receive on your assets. Now, we could take that for an individual and we could add it up for every individual in the country. And this is what we would find expressed as a percentage of total labor income. So in 1980, people living in, say, low-income countries would need wealth of about 100% of labor income. In high-income countries, it would be around 500% of labor income to fund their old age needs. As you can see, this is rising slowly in low-income countries, a little faster in lower middle-income countries, and very rapidly in upper middle-income and high-income countries. So in high-income countries, by 2060, the resources that would be needed to fund old age would be 13 times total labor income. So, is that going to happen? Well, it's not going to happen just by increasing saving and accumulating capital. That's one possibility. But there are other ways that people can generate wealth that can help to meet their material needs in old age. One would be we could embrace programs to some extent that fund old age needs through transfers. And if we do that, that's going to increase the burden of aging on future generations. Now, we may also need to calibrate the way that we earn labor income and our consumption. So we may have to retire later, maintain higher productivity at older ages in order to reduce the needs from assets. The other thing we could do is to reduce consumption. And so that could maybe be done in part by, say, having a more efficient approach to healthcare costs It could also be done by just people sacrificing standards of living. Maybe they don't want to do that. Maybe they do. Maybe people would be satisfied to consume less on average in return for living longer. So those are the 6 main conclusions that we reach in this paper. To return to the question I first asked about whether we're looking at a crisis and the disagreements about that, I think the reason for this is that the prospects are really very mixed. There are some very positive developments that come from the changes in population. If we just look at the economic sphere, slower GDP growth is likely to reduce environmental strains. Higher standards of living in lower income countries are certainly a welcome development, and they may lead to a decline in the differences between income levels and consumption levels in poor countries and rich countries. And third, we might see increased capital intensity and higher productivity as aging occurs. So this would lead to higher income and help to offset some of the effects of aging. But there are some negative developments in aging societies, and we need to understand these and ways that we can respond to minimize the adverse impacts we're likely to experience. So we will have declining support ratios with slower improvements and possibly even decline in living standards. Secondly, we may see particular age groups hit hard by changes in age structure. If we look at existing comparative data, it looks like working age adults are being squeezed severely by population aging. So that's certainly a matter of some concern. Third, we know that there will be a lot of pressure to expand transfer programs that support the elderly. This is likely to lead to high tax rates and burden future generations in ways that we really don't want to do. And in a related way, it's very likely that it will that aging will strain public finances, leading to high levels of public debt. Well, there are many other positive and negative developments that arise with population change that we could talk about, and I'm sure many of you would have ideas about what those are likely to be. But these are the 6 things that we really wanted to highlight. This seemed most important and clear to us, and so I want to thank you for this opportunity to talk about how we view these trends. Thank you very much.